So welcome, my name is Christian Vergara and I will be your instructor for this event. So I work for Microsoft and I'm a technical trainer. So all I do now is 100% training, like this session could be other events or 4-day or 5-day classes. So I'm happy to be with you. And in terms of my experience, I feel like plus than 14 years in the field. Definitely there's a before and after the cloud for me. Before the cloud, I was working things like Active Directory, right management services, Exchange, a lot of work around identity. But in the last 8 years, I had the opportunity to work more with solutions like Azure and Microsoft 365, and always security is such a fascinating topic. So welcome to the Microsoft Security Virtual Training Day Zero Trust event. During this event, we'll cover 5 modules, including a case study. So module number 1 covers what is Zero Trust. Module 2 will learn about identity and devices in Zero Trust. Module 3 covers data and applications. Module 4 introduces infrastructure and networks. And in Module 5, we'll learn about the Zero Trust maturity model, including a case study on how Microsoft adopted Zero Trust. So let's explore what is Zero Trust and from where that term was created. So let's get started with Module 1. So what is Zero Trust? So before, all the current state was easy to manage because we used to have like corporate devices and all the users were connecting to all those services and applications from the corporate network and using those managed devices. But nowadays it's different. So things are evolving so fast now. So now users connect from home. We definitely need to support hybrid models and definitely make sure that all the users stay productive. Also, to make it more complex is that now they use unmanaged devices and now they use also mobile devices. So definitely this is more complex to manage and definitely it's difficult to keep up with all those different threats that can affect us at some point of time. So now we need to navigate to an evolving world. So we have many challenges nowadays, but kind of the 3 main ones. First, the nature of business and work have changed. So in the current pandemic context, a lot of people have to work from home and we need to support those models. Nowadays we have hybrid workers. Most of the users will need to keep working from home most of the time. Secondly, traditional approaches and tools don't just make the cut. So definitely we have cloud-based models, we have platform as a service, software as a service. Traditional tools don't work well with those hosting models and the cloud. And last but not least, the cost of breaches and regulations are increasing over and over. So definitely have things like GDPR that also make things that are more complex to manage and handle. So those are kind of the 3 top challenges that we're facing right now. So we have also just not to protect the corporate devices. Now we need to protect mobile devices, and we need to definitely ensure that not just users are productive. So now we have also to collaborate with partners, we have customers, we have different types of devices, different types of application, just not hosted on a local environment. We have applications hosted on the cloud. So how we can definitely connect all those dots and make sure that definitely all the end-to-end secure state is basically ensured for all the data on the process. So that's basically what Zero Trust is trying to solve for us. So we definitely, there's a need to have a new way, a new security paradigm. So definitely kind of the old and traditional strategies are not enough. So that's definitely why we're building Zero Trust. So what is Zero Trust? Zero Trust is a new term that definitely is evolving, gaining popularity on the last years, but it's basically just a new way to engulf all those different cybersecurity paradigms and how we can move from those static settings, very concentrated and based on isolating that perimeter and protecting the network, to definitely try to concentrate more on users, assets, and resources. So even we have like architecture definitions, we have Zero Trust architectures. In this case, that architecture uses all those principles, in this case, to plan and build an enterprise architecture that basically follows all those core elements. So Zero Trust has 3 main components. That's actually from where the name comes from. So never trust, always verify. Second, definitely try to levers that least privileged access. So things like just-in-time access, just enough access, and always try to use definitely those components that we have now on the cloud. Try to be more proactive and try to find definitely those breaches before definitely those are exposed and affect all the users on your organizations. So Zero Trust is a strategy to increase the security of all those resources and leads to a couple of things. First, make sure that definitely those are aligned with the business assets, data and applications, and that those controls are applied everywhere. It doesn't matter if those are users accessing from an internal corporate network or users accessing from the internet. So Zero Trust leads to three core things. The first one, user access. So you always verify. So every time there's a request made to access to a resource, you will need to authenticate and authorize that request. Secondly, leads also to modern security and operations responses. So definitely we try to be proactively detecting those threats that can impact our environment at some point of time. So let's use machine learning and artificial intelligence. Let's try to be proactive. And we find actually an incident, we can actually automate the response to all those security events. And last but not least is all about definitely operational teams and that center. So definitely how we monitor all those components so we can identify kind of that typical baseline in terms of performance and how users interact with our services or applications. So you can spot any behaviors that are outside that typical baseline. So maybe those are anomalies that need to be investigated and maybe can lead you to a security threat that needs to be mitigated. So definitely increases security and increases productivity. That's difficult to achieve in some cases, the right balance between those two. So Zero Trust, maybe just heard that term, but definitely it's been around for many, many years. And we have two separate tracks. So what you see there in green is a track for the Zero Trust terminology around identities. And in this case, what's on violet is around the Zero Trust terminology, but around network-based Zero Trust. So let's explore first that Zero Trust terminology when it was born around identities. So first, actually, this was created in 2004. So we have like that Jericho form, where formally definitely the term Zero Trust was it basically created to identify a new mechanism to basically authenticate and authorize all the user requests made to access an application. Later on in 2014, we have the Microsoft, in this case, advocates what is known as assume breach is one of the Zero Trust principles that you have at Microsoft. So definitely, just because you have not yet found a breach on your environment, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. So definitely, let's assume that there's a breach going on your environment, but you just don't have visibility about that breach. In 2016, we released something that is known as conditional access. So conditional access is a capability that can help us to facilitate that central policy that can use different signals, and based on those signals like identity or device health can basically allow or deny access to a resource. And it's still going on. In terms of network-based Zero Trust, also back in 2004, we definitely were working with things like network access control architectures, so maybe you implemented something like that. Chances are that maybe you created an isolated VLAN that basically have all those rogue or unidentified unauthenticated clients that basically are isolated once they connect to a network for the first time. So we'll have like a checklist of different things that you first need to validate before you grant access to those devices to your corporate network. In 2010, Forrester coins definitely the Zero Trust term, definitely just to highlight the importance of having like a new mechanism, a new strategy in place for all those fast evolving security threats that are affecting. So definitely they see the need that something different needs to be implemented, moving from that centralized, network-based, isolated, and perimeter definitely approach. In 2014, Google created what is known as the Beyond Corp. So Beyond Corp is basically an implementation of those Zero Trust principles and how we can build our applications and make sure that data is accessed in a way that definitely all those requests are always authenticated, authorized, and how we control all those definitions from a central policy. And 2017 definitely have like a book that is the Zero Trust Networks is definitely one of those O'Reilly books. We have like prescriptive guidance how you can implement and design a network, but following all those Zero Trust principles. And nowadays, definitely the NIST, the National Institute for Standards, created a white paper. And on that white paper that is known as the Zero Trust Architecture, basically it's an implementation and a prescriptive guidance of all those Zero Trust principles and how you should implement those as you're architecting your enterprise architecture. So let's explore in more depth a little bit that definition coming from the NIST. So for the definition coming from the NIST is the Zero Trust goal and principles. So the goal of this definition is to protect the data, computing services. What are we talking about here? So things like mainly infrastructure components and also the business functions. And we're trying to eliminate unauthorized access. So definitely, and how we'll decide if the access is granted or not, will basically combine a lot of different signals and try to be definitely as granular as possible. So definitely try to follow that just in time, just enough access. So definitely following that always popular least privilege principle. So definitely just grant you access only to those resources that you're supposed to have access and is required to do your job. And the principles that you have in this definition are: first, we'll assume that the network is definitely hostile. Second, definitely continue risk analysis and evaluation. Just because you don't have a breach right now doesn't mean that you don't have the visibility that something is going on, and maybe tomorrow you will have a breach on your environment. So definitely never trust, always verify. And the last principle is definitely enact protections to mitigate risk. So what kind of controls we can proactively activate? So definitely minimize the access to the resources, definitely following that least privilege definitely element. Only grant access to those resources that you should have access, and will always validate if the access is still required. Secondly, continuous authenticate that identity and definitely enhance that security posture to grant access to a resource. And the last one is definitely access is granted through a central policy decision point. So we're definitely capture all those signals, like from where the user is connecting, what kind of device you're using, which kind of application actually you're trying to use as a front door to access those resources. So based on all those different elements, you will decide if you will grant the access or not. So on the following link, you will have like the full document that describes more in depth about the NIST Zero Trust goal and principles definition. So in terms of the Zero Trust definition coming from the NIST, we have a definition that is known as the tenets. So on these tenets, those are the core elements of that Zero Trust architecture. The first one is that everything is a resource. This could be a document, this could be an application, this could be a service, could be an API. In this case, we'll refer as everything as a resource. Secondly, you always definitely need to validate access for every resource. So every request that is made to access to a specific resource need to be validated. So definitely first you need to validate the permission. So always authenticate and authorize individually each one of those requests. Third, also very important, is that make sure that definitely all the enterprise-owned systems are definitely secure and patched. So definitely make sure that we have all those updates installed. So definitely have like an anti-malware in place. If it's not updated, it's not very useful. And we also have like those known as zero-day attacks. So the day that a vulnerability is identified is already being exploited. So very important definitely to have all those systems patched every day. The other tenet on those elements is that all communications are secure. So definitely make sure that data is encrypted at transport and addressed. And how we'll control who has access over what. So we try to definitely have a central place that is known as conditional access. So that conditional access will use all those signals based on definitely authentication and authorization results. We'll also validate things like device health, and we'll combine all those things to make a decision if the access is granted or not to a specific resource. And the last definitely tenet that we have in the NIST definition is that the user authentication is not static. So it's dynamic and is always enforced. So definitely understand that things may change over time. So you have a specific role now, and that role grants you access to, let's say, a set of data that has a confidential level of access. Let's say tomorrow you change role maybe on that new role, you no longer have access to that level of confidential information. So definitely we need to dynamically validate all those changes on the state to validate every request that is made to access those resources. So with Zero Trust, we try to secure those assets where they are. So definitely try to move away from that classical or traditional approach. We'll definitely concentrate heavily on that perimeter, and basically we try to filter inbound and outbound traffic out of that perimeter. So definitely try to move away from that. And in Zero Trust, we'll concentrate more. We understand that definitely nowadays that perimeter is not existent. So users are working on the cloud or users are working from home. So definitely you don't have control about those devices or that source from where the users are connecting to their applications. So with Zero Trust, definitely try to protect the data and the access where users are. So it could be you're working from home, using a VPN, using a cloud-based application. So definitely we keep in consideration all those different elements to make a decision to grant you access to a resource or not. And all those decisions are controlled to a central policy. So the new reality definitely makes those security challenges definitely more difficult. So just to mention some of the more important security challenges that have in the new normal. So definitely need to support all the users in a hybrid model. Secondly, we need to increase diversity of endpoints accessing the network. Also, we need to automate threat detection and response. Also, nowadays it's difficult, and you can know that how painful is it in some cases to roll out new security controls. So definitely in some cases it could be that the higher is the security definition, the lower is the end user experience of the poor user experience that will offer at a higher level of security. So we have different tools depending on the purpose, and definitely those tools in some cases are difficult to manage and not compatible between each other, and definitely attackers know those. And because they know those weak points, definitely try to attack those issues and definitely try to identify vulnerabilities across all those different tools that we're using. So what happens also, kind of the last challenge that typically we have is that maybe when we designed that network, we just maybe use a flat structure just to facilitate connectivity, but nowadays it's not enough. So definitely current networks are not optimized definitely to prevent what is later movement. So basically think that on the classic model, everything that's coming from the corporate network basically tends to be or can safely be assumed as to be safe traffic. So if an attacker basically makes the way and is able to have control about the resource that is inside that corporate network, because you just assume that everything that inside the corporate network is safe, you can just definitely keep just moving from one system to another on that corporate network, and at some point of time maybe exfiltrate some of the data. So definitely that is not a good idea when we follow that classic strategy in terms of security. Just to give you an idea, some important numbers that I have available for you is that definitely nowadays we have new solutions, new tools, but attackers as well are using every day more sophisticated tools, more sophisticated attacks. They are also using machine learning and artificial intelligence. So definitely maybe heard about those ransomware attacks, maybe heard about also the SolarWinds security breach. So many things that definitely are happening now every day. Just let's take a look to some of the numbers you have here. First, definitely in 2020, there was around like 230% increase of password spread attacks. Also in terms of data that is uploaded monthly to cloud-based applications or risky applications, basically those is corporate information that is uploaded to the cloud. We're talking about that in month on average is around like 78 gigabytes of data that is uploaded to those risky applications. Also, we just seen on a single month, August 2020, we seen around like 5 billion requests made by the attackers to try to sign in using a legit account. So definitely try to get your credentials and get access to your corporate environment. And last but not least, that third of the attacks basically were around like enterprise accounts that involve phishing. So sophisticated attacks now, in some cases, it's difficult to tell if that email is legit or not. So a lot of definitely users are affected by that phishing attack that definitely happens every day. Let's definitely just name some of the more important threats that we need to face nowadays. So we definitely can compare the old world and the new world. So on the old world, classic, definitely also security strategies were effective in that old world. We talk about users are employees, but guess what? Nowadays, it's just not about the users. Now you also need to facilitate and enhance collaboration, not just for the employees, but you also need to interact with partners, customers, and bots. Old world, you just need to manage corporate devices. Now, we need to support all the models like bring your own device, you have also mobile devices, and in some cases maybe using some sort of IoT as well. So it's more than just corporate devices that need to be managed. On the other world also, you just need to worry about on-premises applications, basically those servers that were hosted on your local on-premises environment. On the new world, definitely we'll see like an explosion of cloud apps. And in some cases, definitely just not a single cloud. In some cases, there's specific companies that have like a multi-cloud strategy. So hosting those applications in different cloud environments. So we're definitely using cloud apps more and more every day. On the old world, you also tend to work as what is referred as monolithic applications. So definitely applications that were developed in-house. They have like that 3-tier, 4-tier applications that you're under control of that. But on the new world, definitely have like composite applications, maybe using microservices, containers, in some cases being tracked with RESTful APIs that maybe are offered by a third party. So that makes things more complex. On the old world, we just needed to manage that corporate network and that firewall, and definitely just need to make sure that that perimeter is safe. But on the new world, definitely that perimeter is not existent, and in some cases is expanded. So definitely it's not just about that corporate perimeter. Now we have a perimeter on the cloud, and depending you have multiple cloud service providers, so you have multiple perimeters that need to be protected. And the last but not least, in the old world, you definitely have like local package tracking and log solutions. That's all you need to definitely make sure that that environment stays safe. But on the new world, definitely have like just explosion of signals. We have like billions of records that are generated, just not by a single firewall. We have multiple devices, we have mobile devices and other types of components that are basically generating multiple signals, so millions of elements every day that in some cases just difficult to keep up to date what's going on your environment. So the new reality definitely needs new principles to make sure that that security posture is managed effectively. So first, definitely need to verify explicitly. Remember, never trust, always verify. So every time you made a request to access a resource, you need to explicitly authenticate and authorize each one of those requests. Secondly, we try to use less privileged access. So definitely things like just-in-time access, just enough access. We try to definitely limit those privileges and the time bound that in this case those privileges can be used. And last but not least, definitely remember the third principle that we have in Microsoft is assume breach. Not just because you don't have currently a breach or you don't have visibility about the breach, just let's assume that there's not a breach in your environment. So definitely we'll assume every time there's a new request that is made, we'll assume that definitely this is related to a breach. So those are the three core principles that lead that zero trust architecture. So let's explore the Microsoft zero trust architecture. So definitely this is a proactive approach around security. So definitely use things like adaptive controls and use continuous verification. So we'll try to proactively find those incidents, investigate those incidents, and actually we can automate the response in some of the cases. So the zero trust across the digital estate, we have 6 components that are the core elements of that Microsoft zero trust strategy. The first one is the identity. To definitely explore each one of those in more depth. After that, we have the devices. After that, we have the applications, infrastructure, and networking. And last but not least, we have the data. That's kind of the most important asset that we need to protect at our organization. So we'll explore each one of those components in more depth. So let's start with the Microsoft Zero Trust architecture. You see there on the left, we have those identities that need to be protected. So those could be users, could be groups, could be devices. On the other end, you also have like those resources. Those could be definitely those applications or those infrastructure components that need to be accessed. But typically what you use to access those resources. So you will use a device. So that device, in this case, you see, can be combined. So now identity is a new control plane to decide if you should have access to those resources or not. So we'll combine. So first, you will need to authenticate and authorize that identity. So you can definitely use things like multi-factor authentication, or you can definitely use risk-based session or user sign-in, and you combine also with the state of the device. So you will see the device is healthy or not, and after that, you will decide if, based on those conditions, a decision needs to be made if the access is granted or not. So basically, we're using that application to access or interact with that data. So on the applications, we try to definitely apply all those adaptive access controls. In terms of data, it's very, very important always to classify, label, and encrypt all the data. And in terms of infrastructure, basically all those components that help us to host those applications, make sure definitely that those stay in a safe state. So all of this is controlled by a central security policy informants. That is where all those decisions are made. And keep in mind that this is not just static, so definitely this is dynamic. And of course, we try to use machine learning, we try to use artificial intelligence. We have like a full threat intelligence capability built on our products. We definitely use things like telemetry. And they already know, for example, from where typically you will connect and access to those resources, which type of application, which type of client, and all that. So definitely anything outside that typical baseline will be spotted as an anomaly. So definitely can have the visibility, and you can also automate the response. So let's see some of the solutions that can help us to achieve that zero trust strategy. So in terms of identities, we can use things like Microsoft Azure AD. In terms of devices, you can use solutions like Microsoft Endpoint Manager. In terms of data, you can definitely use solutions like Microsoft Identity Protection. In terms of applications, you can use solutions like Microsoft Cloud App Security. In terms of infrastructure, you can use Azure Networking Components. And on that threat intelligence piece, we can use solutions like Azure Sentinel and Microsoft Defender. So definitely those are the solutions that are known typically as that SIEM, the Security Incident and Event Manager. But on top of that is also that XDR. It's definitely that solution that can help us to automate the responses based on those decisions. And you see there at the core of it, the central basically engine that controls of that and help us to automate the response is powered by Azure AD Conditional Access. So we'll use all those signals, and based on those signals, it will help us to facilitate if we grant or deny access to those resources. To mention one of those case studies, definitely one of those customers that already implemented this in real life. Just to definitely, if you see this looks good on paper, but it's more than that. Definitely have several customers that already embrace and adopted those zero trust strategies. So one of those is Bridgewater, to definitely using already things like Microsoft Defender and Azure AD. So they're already using things like conditional access and multi-factor authentication, and definitely they help them in this case to adopt that zero trust model and apply this in their own reality. So we just explored from where that zero trust term original was created, and we also covered the important elements of that zero trust strategy. So let's take a 10-minute break. After the break, we'll start module number 2, identity and devices in zero trust. With that zero trust strategy, let's explore the solutions that we have available for you. So let's get started with module 2. So the first step when you're adopting that zero trust strategy is to start with the identity. So that's what we'll start with, identity and devices. So let's explore the content of module number 2. So let's start with identity. So how we can apply those zero trust principles for the identity component. So 4 core elements that lead that zero trust strategy apply to identities. So first, always definitely authenticate and authorize those accounts. So making sure that as users are authenticated to access those applications, try to definitely avoid having like multiple usernames and passwords to remember. So definitely try to use single sign-on, a single account that can be reused to access multiple applications. Second, password is not an effective way to keep the accounts protected. So let's try to use multi-factor authentication. Third, definitely all those different signals related to from where the user is authenticated, from where it's coming from in terms of location, which kind of device. So all those elements can be combined to make a decision based on the policy to see if you grant access to those resources or not. And the last component is the least privileged element. So definitely try to use just in time, just enough access, and try to definitely limit how many users will be part of that group that has elevated privileges. So to secure access to all those applications having single sign-on, something like Azure AD has nice capabilities. So the first one is what happens if you have an existing Active Directory environment. I guess maybe it's most of those cases that you're familiar with. So do I need to recreate my whole user base in Azure AD? No. So we have something like Azure AD Connect, so you can just synchronize all those existing users and groups to Azure AD. Also, Azure AD can be integrated with HR systems like SuccessFactors and Workday. So every time, for example, HR creates those accounts in those systems, this can actually be integrated to automatically create the accounts for you inside Azure AD. And user that single identity created in Azure AD, you just can facilitate the access to applications like Microsoft 365. But on top of that, this works really good also with thousands of software as a service applications like ServiceNow, Salesforce, and many others. So those can be easily integrated with Azure AD for authentication. And also, you can use that for the applications that you develop yourself. And if you host those applications in Azure, it's easy to integrate definitely Azure AD for that authentication piece. But just to highlight that this can be used also if those applications are hosted in different cloud service providers as well. Also, additionally, Azure AD has some nice features in this case to facilitate collaboration. So whether those are partners or customers, so we have B2C, B2B modules that can facilitate also access to those resources for third parties that need to collaborate and get access to your applications. And also what happens in the case that you have on-premises, so applications that are already hosted on your local environment. So a couple of choices. So we have something that is known as Azure AD Application Proxy. This will facilitate the process to expose those applications over the internet if you're still using legacy authentication protocols. Otherwise, you can definitely rely on third-party solutions from Akamai, Citrix that can facilitate also that process to expose those applications to the internet. So in terms of how we'll first verify those identities as part of that authentication and authorization process. So maybe you heard that term of passwordless. Definitely try to move to that definitely element. So definitely try to avoid having like passwords to authenticate accounts. So we're talking about multi-factor authentication. It's about having multiple factors to prove user's identity, basically to validate that you're the user you claim to be. So you can definitely still maybe use the password, or on top of that use another factor, so it could be something that you have. So this could be a hardware, software-based token. This could be also the Microsoft Authenticator. You can receive a notification also over a phone, or even better, something that you are. So biometric controls like Windows Hello or fingerprint sensors that can be the factor that you can use to prove your identity. And now we have solutions, and we're exploring what is known as passwordless. So basically, every time you need to authenticate, you no longer need to type in the password. So you can just use a prompt coming from the Microsoft Authenticator. You can use a Windows Hello. You can use a FIDO key. And basically, that will be the way that you authenticate and prove your user's identity. So multi-factor authentication is very effective and help us in this case to prevent around 99.9% of identity attacks. So how we can control access from that central place? So we have conditional access in Azure AD, and conditional access use all those different signals that definitely will be a combination of user, is this an Azure AD account, is this a Microsoft account, which kind of device is using to connect. Is this a iOS, Android-based device? Is this a managed device? Is the device healthy or not? From where the user is connecting or not? So basically all those will be signals that we basically keep in consideration to make the decision. So a conditional access, you can definitely build that policy, and based on all those signals, so if this is a risk sign-in or if this is an atypical location, you can grant access or not to those applications that you have on the right. So just to highlight that also those could be Microsoft-based applications, or those could be also third-party applications. So definitely could be thousands of software as a service applications that can be integrated easily with Azure AD. And those can even be actually like on-premises, so local applications that you're basically hosting on that local data center can still be definitely protected using conditional access. And the controls that you have available, you can either allow or block the access, you can definitely limit the access, you can allow the access but require a multi-factor authentication. What happens if this is a risky sign-in? Maybe you will allow the access but you request the user to change the password. And what if this application is using legacy authentication? You can actually just explicitly block access using those legacy authentication protocols. How we can enforce that least privileged access with a strong governance? So Azure AD as well has a buildable solution first for identity lifecycle. So definitely help us to automate the typical cycle that you have when users join, later on move, and eventually leave the organization. So we have a solution that can help us to facilitate all the applications and privileges that users should have across time. Secondly, it definitely help us to limit the privileged access. So definitely, if, for example, we would like to grant access to a contractor or someone just temporarily should have privileges, you can just automate that process and can grant those privileges, but those are basically related to specific time bound. So after that time has expired, then the user no longer has those privileges. And last but not least, also has the capability to audit all the access. You can have insights and have a better understanding of, okay, what users are accessing which applications, from where they're connecting, so you can identify that typical performance and usage baseline of the applications. So let's take a closer look to all those capabilities that we have inside Azure AD that can help us to apply those zero trust principles for the identity component. So let's explore some of the common identity challenges we're facing today. So the first one is just that explosion of apps. So nowadays, customers just don't need to basically work with corporate applications. Now we're using a lot on a daily basis, third-party or cloud-based applications. So we can make sure that users are interacting with those applications in a secure way. Secondly, after the pandemic, definitely things changed. So now a lot of definitely workers need to work from home, and even in some cases we still need to maintain that hybrid model and just let some of those users to be productive from home. Third, definitely have like continuously evolving compliance requirements, definitely changing every day. So things like GDPR and other regulations are coming and change definitely the way the controls need to be applied and how we definitely manage all those different security settings for our organization. And the last one definitely that demands for increased productivity. So they will always struggling to find that balance between security and productivity. Definitely make sure that those remote workers are productive every day. So in Zero Trust, we're moving from the perimeter. And in this case, identity is the new control plane. Because you pause for a second, if you control the identity, you can control to which resources, to which data I have access with that account. So that's what very, very important and should be the first step, always around definitely protecting those identities. If I validated and authenticated and authorized that identity, I can definitely be in control to which resources I can connect using that identity. So that is the first step. So we have Azure Active Directory. Keep in mind this is the world's largest cloud identity service. So how big? We're talking about, like, just to give you some numbers, around like 345 millions of monthly active Azure AD users. We're talking about like more than 2,000 Azure AD organizations that basically trust Azure AD as their primary identity solution. And we have more than 30 billions of requests made daily to something like Azure AD. Just to give you some idea, another popular identity provider, maybe you're familiar with Okta. If some using Okta, in this case, in a year, Okta basically has around like 8 billions of requests in a year. In this case, we're talking about 30 billions in a day. So that's actually how big Azure AD is. So Azure AD is one of those services that are known as global services. So basically we have that data replicated, so we can definitely ensure that continuity of the service. So the data is replicated across multiple data centers over the world. So we have around like 100 data centers across the planet where that Azure AD component is available. Keep in mind that each one of those physical facilities, we have all those physical controls in place, like biometric controls, restricted access. On top of that, we also have that 24/7 monitoring, so definitely actively monitoring that physical data center, and on top of that, we're definitely using that threat intelligence as well about all that telemetry that basically is captured from all those authentication requests. And on top of that, we definitely have like experts that work with some agencies, some cases with the government, in this case just to ensure that definitely we address all those new security threats. So how we can secure the organization? We can definitely use the identity as the new control plane. So on the left, remember that's kind of the first step to ensure we secure those identities. So we'll use those identities, we'll use those devices. So you can definitely, that provides the context. So depending on which identity, if that account is using something like multi-factor authentication, it might be using a device that is in a healthy state, I can decide what happens next. So I can say, okay, I grant you access to that data, to those applications, that infrastructure, or that network. So definitely can simplify that when you follow that zero trust strategy. So keep in mind that Azure AD is based on protocols, on the standards. So definitely things like SAML, OpenID Connect, OAuth, definitely those are the standards that Microsoft has been actively contributed on the last years. And Azure AD is based on top of those standards on the industry. Also, we have like a close collaboration with partners like FIDO and others, definitely to have all those different solutions in terms of passwordless and also for that decentralized identity. So because we build Azure AD on top of those standard protocols on the industry, this just facilitates that interoperability with other partners on the ecosystem. So definitely in terms of passwordless, we have things like Yubico, we have partners like FIDO, we have also definitely in terms of identity governance, we have partners like Imprivata, we have partners like Omada. In terms of, remember those HR enabled provisioning, we definitely have partnerships with Workday and SAP SuccessFactors that definitely can facilitate those interactions. In terms of custom authentication factors, we can definitely use tokens from Duo, Symantec, Twilio. Also in terms of pre-integrated single sign-on, we have definitely partnerships with Atlassian, ServiceNow, Zendesk, and definitely for all those hybrid models, if you would like to publish those legacy applications, you can still use solutions from Akamai, Citrix, because everything is based on those standards coming from the industry. Those are just some stories to give you an idea of some customers that are using Azure AD already. So we have definitely, just to give you an idea, we have customers across different industries, so from financial services, government, healthcare, manufacturing, media and telco and retail. So different customers definitely that are already using Azure AD, in some cases to facilitate that process to collaborate with partners, in some cases actually to facilitate customers that need to sign in to all those different services that are accessible through Azure AD. So those are just some of those success stories of customers already using Azure AD to facilitate that authentication and authorization process following that zero trust strategy. So let's explore the capabilities that we have inside Microsoft Azure AD. So we have 4 core components that are provided by Azure AD aligned with that zero trust architecture. The first one is that secure adaptive access. Secondly, the seamless user experience. Third, unified identity management. And the last, simplified access governance. So let's explore each one of those in more depth. So let's go first with secure adaptive access. So for secure adaptive access, what do I mean by that? Definitely that seamless experience, user-friendly, and you would definitely like to use something like multi-factor authentication. It's not a complex solution. You can just facilitate the access. You can actually just use something like Windows Hello and use the embedded camera that you have on your enabled device to perform that multi-factor authentication. So definitely very user-friendly, that we want to affect productivity. Secondly, you can customize those policies in conditional access to define, okay, which access basically is granted under which specific conditions. And the last definitely capability that is important is definitely that user and entity behavior. So basically keep track of all that telemetry, and we can automate the response. So what happens if there's a risky sign-in or there's a risky session, we can definitely automate the response. We can definitely maybe request to provide a multi-factor authentication. Or if this is a risky account, maybe the account is being compromised, maybe you can request to change the password. So you can automate all those from Azure AD. So to protect the identities with conditional access, remember that conditional access will just gather all those different signals around the user allocation, type of device, which application, it is an authorized application, or also even those real-time risks that definitely use that powerful threat analysis. And based on all those different signals, definitely will be like a combination of all those elements, and based on those capabilities, you will decide what happens next. You can either allow access, require multi-factor authentication, limit access, you can request a password reset, or you can just log that activity. And after that, definitely you can just control to which applications and to which data that user has access using those devices and all those different signals that are considered to make a decision. In terms of identity protection, is a very, very interesting service that we have available in Azure AD. Basically, we keep track of all those elements in real time, and we can automate the remediation. So we can definitely know what's the typical, for example, locations. You have users that are connecting from a specific country. If you spot, for example, that, let's say, a user tries to log in from a country that is not the typical one that is connecting from in the last 5 years, they will not, no, that's maybe anomaly, that's not part of a typical behavior, you can automate the response. You can say, you know what, if this is a medium, high level risk, you can either request to change the password, or you can either request also to perform a multi-factor authentication. So this service definitely can help us in this case to increase at 300, definitely in terms of password spray attacks, definitely have increased in the last year. So the service like this can help us to effectively mitigate this kind of attacks. Keep in mind that behind the scenes, it just not definitely keep that telemetry, and those are just not static controls that are in place. So definitely use machine learning and artificial intelligence behind the scenes to automate that response for you. Second component that we have is that seamless user experiences. So for that seamless user experience, just a single account, so the same account that I use maybe to log into my device is the same one that will be used in this case to authenticate to thousands of applications. So definitely seamless user experience. Second, what happens, you would like to request access to a specific application or a specific service, you can do this yourself. You don't definitely need to contact an admin or you need to contact IT. You can do this yourself. And the last one is definitely, it's just that night balance, definitely in terms of authentication. So what happens, you have an existing Active Directory environment. What happens about what factors I would like to use for authentication is very, very flexible. You can choose across multiple factors and multiple ways to let users authenticate to access those resources. So for that seamless user experience, just to highlight that you have a huge ecosystem that is more than just Office 365. So you have thousands of applications that can be easily integrated with Azure AD, so you can just facilitate that single sign-on. So this is possible. You can definitely control to a centralized, definitely portal where users go and validate the applications that are available to them. If an application is not available for them, they can actually request user themselves access to those applications. And you can definitely validate and basically separate those legitimate and non-legitimate access requests to those applications. That's just to give you an idea how that portal looks like. So in terms of password and multi-factor authentication, in the last months, we're talking more about the passwordless approach. So how we can move to that passwordless approach. So we can definitely use technologies like Windows Hello to use biometric controls, basically just a special camera that has an embedded component that allows you to do facial recognition. So you can actually use that as an authentication, so that way you don't need to type in a password to authenticate yourself. You have also Microsoft Authenticator. In this case, you will get a prompt, you approve that prompt, and that's actually what you use to authenticate instead of typing in that password. And the last option that definitely was provided to one of those partners is using FIDO keys. So with those FIDO keys, basically you plug in the key that will be the component that will be used for authentication. So you don't definitely need to manually type in that password anymore. So we definitely seen a momentum in this. So we have around like 150 millions of active password users inside Azure AD. So definitely passwords are complex to manage and definitely just increase the complexity of that security strategy. So definitely passwordless is more effective and help us to keep those accounts secure. In Unified Identity Management, let's explore the capabilities that they have available for Azure AD. So with that Unified Identity Management, you can connect definitely applications like Salesforce, applications like SAP and others that can be easily integrated with Azure AD to facilitate authentication. So it doesn't matter, those could be applications actually hosted on the cloud, but those could be also applications that maybe you developed in-house. Those can be easily integrated with Azure AD to facilitate that authentication and authorization process. So that way you don't need to build yourself all that logic into the code of your applications. Also can help us in this case to manage all those accounts from a central place. It doesn't matter if those accounts belong to employees, those accounts belong to partners, those accounts belong to customers. You don't definitely need to create an account for each one of your partners or each one of your customers. You can just definitely let customers or partners use their own accounts to authenticate, but basically you can have control about the level of access that those accounts have over your resources. And you can have definitely that granularity, so you can follow that just in time, just enough access principle of zero trust. So you can be very, very specific and granular in terms of the actions and permissions that are granted to execute against your environment with something like role-based access control. In terms of external identities, we have several modules. So we have business to customer, we have also business to business, if those are customers or if those are partners that need to be allowed into your environment. You can just facilitate that with Azure AD, and that way you don't need to create those accounts yourself. So you just let those customers or the users basically authenticate using their own and existing accounts. So those accounts can be hosted in different identity providers. Could be definitely things like Amazon, Google accounts, could be also accounts coming from social media, Facebook, Twitter accounts. So you can just let users use that account to authenticate, but you will basically build that policy that controls to which applications and which level of access those accounts have over your resources. So for those role-based access controls, that is that how that granularity is achieved in Azure AD, you have three core components. The first one, you have the principal, that is basically is that either the user, group, or service principal, or that managed identity that basically will be granted the privilege. Second, you have like a set of built-in roles. You have across like 70 built-in roles like owner, contributor, reader. So for most common scenarios, those are enough. But you can actually build your custom definitions. If you would like to be very, very specific about the permissions that this account should have, you can create that custom definition yourself. And after that, you will need to attach that role and the principal to a specific scope. So we have those three scopes available. So you can definitely grant that role at the management group. That is basically a way to group multiple subscriptions. You can also grant that role at the subscription level. You can run those roles specifically just to a specific resource group. So definitely just in terms of a scope, you can just let users to access a set of different resources or just a specific resource group. So you can be very, very specific with those airbag controls inside Azure AD. The last set of capabilities that we have in Azure AD are related to simplified access governance. So for that, access governance is all definitely facilitate that integration. So what happens if that account was initially created in an Azure platform, we'll just automate the creation of those accounts. We'll just grab information coming from there around all those different attributes coming from that Azure platform, but the account will be created inside Azure AD. You also have solutions like Entitled Management. You also have solutions like Privileged Identity Management that can help us to facilitate. The moment you create that account, you automatically will grant access to a set of different resources and applications out of the box. If users need more capabilities or more privileges than that, they can basically request. So with Privileged Identity Management, you can determine how longer users can grant and can have those privileges over time. So for the identity lifecycle, the first capability, for the moment, we have support for those three. We have support for Workday, SuccessFactors, and Oracle. So if the account is created in any of those HR platforms, that can definitely automate the process to create the account inside Azure AD. So we can just follow the typical join, move, and leave lifecycle of that account in that environment. And on that, definitely, if those are new hires or whether you're on that move stage, you can just control from a central place to which applications, to which resources that account has access over time. For the access lifecycle, this is actually how this looks like. So the first time that user is created in that HR system, so it will definitely trigger a process, and at that point of time, the user is onboarded, so automatically will basically grant them access. If after that they would like to request access for additional resources, no problem. So definitely this operates in a self-serve model, so users can just request access to additional resources. After that, someone will need to approve that request. If that access is approved, then the user will have access to other resources. So definitely always following that just enough access principle coming from that zero trust architecture. In terms of the privileged identity management solution that we have in Azure AD, is definitely temporarily, most of the time, you just need to definitely grant access to privileged roles like an administrator or an owner. So for example, never a good idea to have permanent members into those groups. So typically those tasks that are required for those privileges, the manager that definitely just temporarily have those privileges. So with PIM, what you can do, the user can just request, for example, say, I will need to have those administrator privileges. So probably you can just automate the process. You can grant that administrator role to a user, but only for a specific time bound. So let's say you will grant that privilege for a couple of hours or a day, but after that day, basically those privileges are automatically taken out from that account. So after that, you will no longer have those privileges. Typically, it's that when you already accomplished that task where those privileges were required in the first place. So those are all those different services that we have around Microsoft Azure AD. This is just a collection of some of those important resources around Azure AD, all those nice features, and how you can follow that zero trust strategy for the identity component. Let's proceed now with the second component of this module, that is about devices. So how we can apply those zero trust principles, but for the devices. In this case, we refer to some cases as well as endpoints. So the principles leading that zero trust architecture for the devices should be definitely always around, remember, using single sign-on, multi-factor authentication, and control the access with a central policy, and always try to definitely apply that least privilege element. So multi-factor authentication, members definitely will protect those identities. We have also those powerless options available now. So those are actually the options that they have available for the moment. So for the passwordless approach, you can definitely use either FIDO keys, Microsoft Authenticator, or just let users to, in preview, use a code coming from a text message or a temporary access pass. So those are the options in this case that users can use to authenticate instead of actually typing in a password. Definitely those are more effective and can help us to increase security over time. So let's explore also one of those nice features that I have around identity for Azure AD, that is that self-service password reset. So typically on a help desk organization, closely we have like around 60-70% of the calls that we have on a monthly basis are related to password resets. So with a solution like that, basically you can just decrease that time that is spent in this case to reset passwords. You can definitely apply that time. It's something that can create more value to the business. So with that self-service password reset, just to highlight that this works either for accounts created directly in Azure AD, but this works as well for accounts that maybe were created in a local Active Directory environment. We'll just let users register to the service. You can definitely define which elements are required. So you can definitely things like security questions. You can also use factors like, of course, Microsoft authenticated app and others. And after that, what happens if the user would like to reset the password? You will just let users do this by themselves. So all you need to go is go to a site, change the password, and at that point of time is we'll definitely need to pass all those challenges that were part of the moment when they're registered for the service. So definitely answer those security questions, and on top of that, a combination of maybe receive a code over email and approve maybe that request on the authenticated app, and you will just let users change the passwords by themselves. So enforce the least privileged access with a strong governance. We have all those solutions for the identity lifecycle. We have also that privileged identity management. We have also access reviews available as part of Azure AD. And on top of that, remember this is actually complementary with something that is known as Microsoft Defender for Identity. So remember, it will be a combination of all those different signals. So in these terms, in terms of the health state of the device, you can use Microsoft Defender to validate if that device is basically configured in a state that is healthy or not. And based on that, you can decide if you want access to those resources or not. So definitely will be a combination of those two. So let's explore those options that you have to follow those zero trust principles applied to devices in more depth. So the challenges that we typically face when we're managing endpoints or devices. So those are just to name a few of those challenges that we typically face by ourselves. So the first one, definitely, now we have distributed workers, we have endpoint diversity, so it's more than just corporate-owned devices. So we have mobile devices or people working from home and having maybe that bring your own device. You also have productivity is an important one. Definitely make sure that employees basically are productive and we ensure there is success. And also in terms of cybersecurity, we have like all those risks and attacks that are every day more sophisticated. So those are kind of the common challenges that we have when we need to definitely manage all those devices, all those endpoints. And not to mention how we definitely need to apply those updates and make sure that those devices are updated every day. So how we can address all those different challenges? Just to give you some numbers in terms of distributed workers, we have like around like 49 million of remote workers that definitely say that takes in some cases days or even up to several weeks to get an issue fixed. Second, in terms of endpoint diversity, 48% of IT leaders say that ensuring that data security is one of the top challenges in supporting end users in a productive way. Around employee satisfaction, we have a number around like 44% of remote workers say that they have access, but they don't have access to all the resources they need. And in terms of cybersecurity, keep in mind that around 65% of enterprise need to ensure that security and compliance across multiple devices. So definitely it's not just having a specific type of device, it's no longer just having corporate devices. So multiple types of devices, including mobile devices in some cases, that need to be managed. And definitely make sure we don't have any data exfiltration or security breaches maybe that can be initiated on those devices. So definitely it's a challenging time. So we definitely require a modern management. But what do I mean by modern management? So modern management means definitely let's try to leverage that cloud intelligence. So definitely try to leverage that artificial intelligence that we have available in the cloud. Let's try to definitely improve that end user experience. So definitely that way we don't need to sacrifice productivity. Also, let's try to simplify those administration and all those typical operations. And definitely, users don't need to wait weeks until an issue speaks. Let's try to definitely quickly solve those issues. And why not? Maybe let's try to automate that response. In that sense, we can definitely adopt that zero trust security model. We can consistently definitely manage all those emerging and other devices in that environment. And we can definitely, why not, leverage also all those solutions maybe that are available to a partner. So let's take a look to Microsoft Endpoint Manager. So with Microsoft Endpoint Manager is a unified platform. So doesn't matter if we're using something like System-Centered Configuration Manager, or using something like Intune, you can definitely just have a central place where you can manage the policies applied to all those devices on board and maybe in those solutions. Has that built-in protection. So all Windows 10 devices have that endpoint component available that can definitely just facilitate a lot of the process and those settings that can be applied in there. And definitely has that comprehensive scalability. So you can definitely just have those policies applied, and all those policies can be easily managed just from a central place. So all those elements combined that are part of the core elements of Microsoft Endpoint Manager can help us that at the end of the year definitely have a reduced total cost of ownership. So in terms of unified management, this means definitely extend the benefits that they have in terms of the cloud. So definitely, if users in the first place are using the cloud to access the applications and basically to connect to a VPN or something like that, basically just manage all those components from that central place. So we can definitely also ensure that business continuity for those remote and hybrid workers, definitely making sure that they have access to those applications they need. If they have issues on the process, we can definitely just quickly fix those issues. We can definitely protect all those devices. It doesn't matter if those are corporate devices, bring your own device, mobile devices, and nowadays we have also virtual desktops. It doesn't matter if those are virtual or physical assets that you need to protect. All of those can be managed from a central place in Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. So how we can extend those benefits of the cloud management? Definitely, this has a capability that is known as co-management. So it doesn't matter, you already have devices onboarded in Configuration Manager, you already have devices onboarded on Intune, you have like a central place to manage those policies, and those policies can be applied to the devices that are already onboarded in any of those solutions. So how you can provide that business continuity for remote and hybrid workers? So facilitate just the process to grant them access to the applications they need. So those could be Office 365 applications. Remember, I shared with you also could be also these third-party applications based on the cloud. But just make sure definitely they have access to those applications or services they need, and that this can help us to basically stay productive. It doesn't matter which type of application or which type of device I'm using. Definitely it's all about have access to the resources that you need when you need. In terms of protecting those devices, definitely have like my devices, virtual desktop, so all of those can be managed from a central place inside Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. And also we have a nice solution that actually called My Stuff, and that solutions can facilitate a lot if on your scenario you have like frontline workers, so that will definitely help you to manage that from a central and simplified console, so that you can apply those policies, and maybe have shared devices. You can just still manage all those policies and settings from a central place. And also one of the nice features I like is that definitely has the capability to manage both physical devices or virtual desktop devices. In some cases we have like VDI environments are prepared as well. And of course, this has integration with that solution in Azure. So maybe some of you are using Azure Virtual Desktop. This can be integrated as well and can simplify the process to manage all those virtual desktops hosted on top of Azure as well. So for the built-in protection, can help us in this case that the data stays protected over time, can definitely help us to validate that those devices are configured on a compliant and healthy state, and definitely can help us to proactively detect and identify breaches. Definitely, if you identify that maybe user is basically doing some suspicious activity, maybe is like typically downloads a file every day from SharePoint, but on the last days he downloaded like hundreds of files in the last 5 days. So, and this behavior has been consistent, so maybe this potentially is an incident. Maybe we need to take a look what's going on there. So you can definitely use all those capabilities from Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. And of course, this will already triage and analyze those risks and will provide us with some automated response how we can mitigate all those risks. And how to protect definitely the company data. Remember, as part of those zero trust principles, definitely all the data should be classified, labeled, and encrypted. So you can basically build conditions, and this can be integrated with Microsoft Identity and Information Protection, and can definitely facilitate just a combination of all those different signals. So what kind of device you're using, if this data is being already labeled, if this data confidential or not, and definitely based on all those parameters, you can definitely make that decision if you will let users access those resources or not. In terms of device and app compliance, you can definitely just use that combination of what kind of devices you're using, if this specific device, if let's say this is a mobile device, is being rooted or not, is the device having like an anti-malware solution, is the device with the latest operating system or firmware installed. You can definitely validate all those things to determine if the device is configured on a healthy state or not, and which kind of application are you using, if it is an authorized application or not. And based on all those factors, you can decide if users can access to the application or not. And of course, you have like that layer approach. So you see that from one end, you have like DDoS attacks, bot attacks, or web app attacks that can affect your applications upon a time. So it will just help us to have all those controls in place. We can definitely protect, detect, and investigate and respond if needed all those security breaches that maybe can affect us eventually. So proactive remediate the vulnerabilities. Microsoft definitely Defender for Endpoint on all those different capabilities. It already can alert you if definitely there's been a suspicious activity. You can say, you know what, this is not a typical interaction that users has with the application or with this data, or you know actually have like users that are trying to access some confidential files and they don't have the access to do that. So maybe this is being consistently done on the last hours or days. It can proactively alert you, so it can definitely take actions and validate all those different incidents. In terms of that comprehensive scalability, you have a nice capability that is known as zero touch. So with zero touch, you can basically just shift those devices to end users, and users, all you need to do is to log in, and during the first login, automatically all those different applications and all those different levels of access can be automatically deployed behind the scenes for them, so they can transparently be just productive in a matter of minutes. So that's nice features. It works well definitely Windows-based devices, works also with Apple devices and also with Android enrollment. So basically just ship the device, and the first time the users log in, you will just get access to all those different applications that are transparently installed and configured properly for them. In terms of also, remember one of the challenges was to reduce the time required to fix an issues and make users productive. So you can just definitely simplify that process. You can reduce those cycles and definitely make sure that those devices are configured on a safe state. If you need to deploy the updates, you can definitely manage all those updates from a central place and automate that deployment from a central place. It doesn't matter which type of device this is. And for the managed digital state health, Yammer is definitely just following those zero trust principles. It's just this combination of, okay, if you have that identity that has been authorized and authenticated, and you have that device and you validated the state of that device, so if that device is healthy or not, you can decide, okay, if the user was properly authenticated and if the device is healthy, then I will let those users access to those resources. Otherwise, you can definitely block access, or you can actually request multi-factor authentication and all those different controls, but everything from a central policy. And the last but not least is around the automated updates. So for the automated updates, you can definitely make sure that those devices are consistent over time. It doesn't matter which type of device this is. Make sure definitely this is an Android device, Apple device, this is a Windows device. You can just make sure in this case that those devices are up to date. The path definitely to zero trust with that user event management capability. So for that unified endpoint management, just to highlight in this case, remember we talk about the core elements of that zero trust architecture. So we have identities, endpoints, applications, data, and infrastructure. So how all those elements will map to all those different capabilities that I have available in Microsoft. So for identities, of course, we're talking about Azure AD. For endpoints, we have Microsoft Defender for endpoints. We have solutions like MDMs, mobile device management. For applications, we have app protection policies, we have app configuration policies. For data, we have disencryption, device policies. For infrastructure, we have things like conditional access, threat and vulnerability management. And for network, we have network protection policies and network access control, or VPNs. So the first set of controls, definitely in terms of identities, you can use definitely those capabilities from Azure AD, like single sign-on, conditional access, multi-factor authentications to protect those identities. To protect the endpoints, we can definitely use something like Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. They can definitely help us to make sure that those devices have like an antivirus, that the disk is encrypted, they have a firewall enabled. If you have any issues, definitely provide us with those incidents, and definitely that endpoint detection and response. All of those are embedded in all those different solutions. So definitely it's how those zero trust controls are mapped into those solutions. In terms of applications, you can definitely use solutions like Microsoft Cloud App Security. You can definitely use app protection from Endpoint Manager. In terms of data, you can definitely, as part of the settings that you can apply to the devices, you can make sure that those disks are encrypted. You can definitely define that set of capabilities that should be considered to define if the device is compliant or not. And in terms of infrastructure, you can definitely apply those conditional access, threat and vulnerability management controls. In terms of network, you can use network protection policies, network access control, and virtual private networks. So let me show you all those components in action with Azure demo. So let's go to the Microsoft 365 security side. So in here, what I like is you have like a central place, and from the central place, you can just definitely have that visibility of the security score. So you can definitely have all that state around identities, data, devices, and apps already trashed and analyzed for you. So you can just validate if you have any actions to review, you have any significant threats that were identified already. So let's explore first those improvement actions. So on those improvement actions, you see those are kind of the set of recommendations that I can proactively apply on my environment, and this will help me to increase or improve that security posture. So let's explore that one that says the filters. You'll see here the filters, just to show you they can explore all those recommendations. Those can be filtered by application, by data, by device, identity, and infrastructure. All those components you see actually from that list of core elements that I have on that zero trust strategy. So let's filter, for example, by identity. Let's see just all those recommendations related just for identity. You see in those recommendations for identity, now you show me the recommendations, but just around that specific topic. So now you see turn sign-in risk policy, turn on user risk policy. You should have like resolve unsecure account attributes, and you see I have actually one at the bottom, require multi-factor authentication for administrative roles. So all those recommendations by just related specifically for identities. Let's take a look to that require MFA for administrative roles. So see actually it tells me what's the action plan. And what I like about this is it's not a just high level recommendation. It's definitely very prescriptive. It tells me definitely at a glance what's the category, what's the user impact, what are the users that will be affected if I follow this recommendation, and it tells me the prerequisites and the steps actually to apply that recommendation. So let me actually, if I click here, in actions, this will take me directly to Azure AD and to the conditional access definition, so I can actually enable that control of requesting multi-factor authentication to a conditional access policy. You see in this case I have a set of different policies that were already implemented, and some of those actually help me to request that MFA factor. So let's explore that one that is known as require MFA or compliance device state to access Office 365. So you see here there's a set of different conditions like users and groups, cloud apps, conditions could be in terms of locations, and after that, based on those conditions, you will decide in access controls. You see in this case, I grant the access, but I requested a multi-factor authentication. You see there at the bottom, the policy is not yet enabled. So for now, it's just on report only mode. So basically, it will just flag a new record on the log represented every time, for example, a user made a request to access to that application and the policy was applied. Let's explore a different one. Let's take a closer look to that one that says password change required for risky users. In this case, actually this policy, for example, takes in consideration that user risk factor coming from identity protection, and this is like a high level definitely risk factor for that user. It will just request a password change. So let me show you the definition. You see I will grant access to the resource, but you will see I require a password change. So it's actually kind of those controls that are implemented in that conditional access definition. In this case, you see, let's switch this policy to on. So at this point of time, the policy will be enabled. So basically, if the user meets the condition, then in this case, you will grant the access, but you will request a password change. Let's take a look to that Microsoft endpoint. So go to the Microsoft Endpoint Manager. This is more about actually the state of the different devices. So we'll see in this case in terms of the devices. I see definitely some alerts from the central place. Let's take a closer look in this case to the devices. Let's see the devices that are already onboarded into this console. So we have how many devices, what type of operating system, and also can get that visibility about the status of the enrollment and if you have any enrollment failures over time. Let's take a look to the just devices related to iOS devices or iPadOS devices. So you go here, you see definitely so far, I have devices that are already in this case detected. But let me show you in this case the policies that I have here. So go to compliance policies, have a couple of policies. Let's explore one of those just to show you the settings that you can control those type of devices. You go to the policy, you can validate in this case compliance state for those devices. So which one of those devices has that policy assigned, which one of those devices are compliant or not. Just let's explore the properties of the policy just to show you the kind of things that you can control. Just in this case, you can control if the devices are jailbroken, if, for example, in terms of system security, you can require a password to be enabled on those devices. You can definitely play a little bit with that password complexity, and you can actually automate that compliant state. So what happens if the device is not compliant? What will you do in this case to make sure that that compliance state is evaluated against? Maybe eventually you will just address those requirements and make sure that that device is compliant now. Let's explore now the apps, just to show in this case for those app protection policies that I have here. So the app protection policies is all about definitely making sure that the data is secured. It doesn't matter which type of device you're using to access if this is corporate data. So go to the applications, let's go to app protection policies. Let's explore that Intune app protection policy. This one is for iOS devices. You see in this case, you have how many users in this case basically connected to those applications over time. And if I go to the properties of the policy itself, you can definitely just target specific applications. You can see in this case all those different Office-related applications on those mobile devices. You can definitely control things like prevent backups, send org data to other apps, select apps that will be accepted in this case basically to manage corporate data. You can definitely control all those different actions, how users interact with the data in those devices. So with that, we just explore how you can use things like conditional access and Microsoft Endpoint to secure identities and devices following that zero trust strategy. So just to end another success story, this in this case is different companies called Etor, and they applied also those components. They are already using cloud app security, they're using Azure AD and multi-factor authentication to secure remote workers, which is definitely in this case they help to achieve and basically embrace that zero trust architecture. This concludes module number 2. We'll take a quick 10-minute break and then we'll start module number 3, data and applications. Those data and applications elements from that zero trust strategy can be applied on the solutions that I have available for you in Microsoft. So let's get started with module 3. So next element of that zero trust strategy is data and applications. So that's what we're exploring in this module number 3. So let's take a look to zero trust element related to applications first. So for applications, we have core principles. The first one, discover and control the applications in your environment. That we'll talk about shadow IT. Second, extend policy informants into the session. So definitely no longer need to do those things static, so definitely need to control those things in real time. Third, protect sensitive data in cloud applications. So definitely this could be applications hosted on the cloud, how make sure that the data stays in a way that is encrypted and labeled if required. And the last option is also that protect applications from those risks, and definitely try to use that cloud intelligence. Let's try to definitely be proactive and be one step ahead of attackers. So the first step is discover and control applications in your environment. So to discover those applications, we first definitely need to analyze that risk element. So definitely have multiple applications, but not necessarily all those applications represent a risk. So definitely need to first assess that risk. So definitely those applications represent a risk or not. So in cloud app security, you can actually define those unsanctioned apps. So definitely you define this as a blocked unsanctioned app. This means that basically users cannot use that application to access corporate resources. So for example, users are using something like Dropbox or other type of applications of that nature, and they actually try to, for example, upload a corporate file in those applications, they won't be allowed to do it. You can actually just create that safe list of applications that actually can be used from those mobile devices to interact with that data related to corporate resources. So to protect that sensitive data in cloud applications, in Microsoft we have a different approach. What I like is that we first discover and definitely classify the data where it is. Once we classify the data, we apply labels, and once you apply the label actually becomes a part of the file itself. So if the file is moved from a different place to another, basically that label stays with the file. So that way that file is always encrypted. So you can definitely classify that, and that label will definitely include all those different levels of classifications. We can have things like publicly available, confidential, highly confidential. So you can definitely apply all those controls and all those different labels. You will define which users have access to that file and at which level. So you can definitely be very specific. You can say this set of users can edit the file, this set of users can print the file. You can definitely have all those different levels defined. And after that, you can actually always monitor and investigate and remediate those risks. You can definitely identify, okay, which kind of users, for example, are trying to access to those confidential files. And maybe you can identify that, let's say this is an attack, someone's trying to exfiltrate data, and there's just like thousands of attempts made to open some confidential files. So you can definitely maybe investigate those things and proactively solve those issues. So to protect the apps, you can actually expand this with cloud app security. It's more than just Microsoft-based apps. So those can be thousands of applications that can be easily incorporated from the central policy of cloud app security. And while users are connecting and accessing those applications, you can definitely, in the session moment in real time, you can define what happens next, if actually users are allowed to use their application or not. So that's actually what you can do with cloud app security. So let's take a closer look to what you can do with Microsoft Cloud App Security to enforce those zero trust application principles. So with Microsoft App Security, we'll explore a couple of important elements. So first, we'll see what is shadow IT, what is important, how Microsoft Cloud App Security can be incorporated with information protection, how all this can be also easily converted into a policy in conditional access. Can definitely help us to mitigate those threats. And the last piece, how we can definitely enhance that cloud security posture. So let's start with what is shadow IT. So shadow IT basically the use of applications or devices that in this case are not managed by the IT. So it could be let's say you're using a third-party cloud-based application, but the problem is that you use that application in a way that affects information that is related to corporate resources. So let's say you try to upload a document that is confidential in something like Dropbox. You should be allowed to do it or not. So ideally not. So that's actually what we have with shadow IT. So definitely to have control about those applications or those devices, how we can definitely make sure that access to that data stays compliant. So we have several challenges with shadow IT. So definitely have things like eventually data loss, lack of security, compliance issues, or duplication or inefficiency in some cases. We try to use multiple tools. There's some overlapping, difficult to manage, complex to maintain, and definitely attackers typically see the weak point there and leverage that capability. So there's an interesting statistic from Gartner around the cost of shadow IT. So typically an IT department spends between 30 to 40% of its entire budget to deal with shadow IT, identify all those unsanctioned apps, so basically, or equipment, but basically that is being used to, in any way, for example, work or alter information related to that company. So Cloud App Security can perform that shadow IT discovery. So in real time, as users are interacting with your files and all those different documents, you can identify what kind of applications they're using on a daily basis. So has that shadow IT discovery module embedded? So definitely just grab all the telemetry and we'll provide it with those reports. Because you know what? Yeah. By default, it already has something that is known as a security score. So we'll know that, for example, something like Teams or something like Microsoft Word Online is an application that definitely has its reputation. There are some security policies that can be implemented, so it will have a score. So the higher is the score, so typically this is a safe application to let users basically interact with to access the data. But you have other applications that, let's say, typically, you cannot apply policies, you cannot have control about how users interact with those applications, will have a lower score. So based on that score, you can automate that response. So once you identify all those applications, you can just perform that discovery. So once you identified all those applications, it can automate that risk assessment. It can really tell you this is a high score, low scored application. You can customize the list. You can definitely block applications that you know, no, I will not let users to use something like Dropbox to basically manipulate corporate data. You can definitely build that logic easily with Cloud App Security. In terms of information protection, what you can do with Cloud App Security, those two can be integrated. So with information protection, it's all about definitely first identify and classify the data, and then you will identify all those different levels of access. So definitely information that maybe is public domain, anyone should have access to those files, but you have, as you go over the pyramid, you maybe have information that is confidential and highly confidential. So maybe only a subset of individuals should have access to that specific set of records. So once you identify those records to definitely classify the data, you can just easily build those labels. So on those labels, you will just build that logic of which persons or which groups has which permissions over those documents, just following definitely those classifications. You can actually let users manually apply those labels, or you can automatically apply those labels, or in real time, as users, for example, are trying to upload a file, let's say to Dropbox, using Cloud App Security, you can already, for example, if the data is already being labeled, no, this is a confidential file. I will just not let that user to upload the file to Dropbox. I know this is a confidential file. So you can block those things in real time. So let me actually show you this in action in a short demo. So let's go to that Microsoft 365 security portal. We have definitely that security score on all those elements around identity, data, devices, and applications. Let's explore a little bit those classification options. Let's explore those sensitivity labels. So on the left, just let me go to classifications and let me choose sensitivity labels. So on sensitivity labels, you see you have the labels, the policies, and all those labels. You have actually a couple of those that came out by default, but is where you will define that logic, that what kind of users have which permissions allowed with those files. You see actually there's an order where you can have many of those labels defined. So let's explore those labels that I have here. This is the full list of all those policies. You see definitely depending on all those labels, when you first classify the information, you will determine all those different levels of access to the file. So general, confidential, information that is confidential but should be available to all the employees, or information that is confidential but should be allowed just to a specific set of individuals. So you just basically build all those levels of access to the information through those labels. So once you define those labels, let's explore now the label policies. So you cannot just directly apply the labels. So you will need to create a policy, and on the policy, you will basically define the labels that are part of the policy, and you can apply that policy to users or groups. So in this case, have a couple of policies. Let's explore that first policy just to show you what I have here. So in the first policy, you have several labels that are included in this policy, and also you have basically to which users that policy is applied. So as for example, every time those users are creating those files, you can see definitely in this case you have a label that is mandatory, and users must provide, for example, a justification if would like to change the label. So you can define what this label known as a general or confidential will be the default one. So every time, for example, the users are creating a document, they will inherit that label of general compliance. If you would like to switch a different label, they will definitely need to provide a justification, and you can definitely define it either a label must be provided or not. So that way, for example, documents are always labeled and encrypted by default. That's actually what you can define on those policies. So let me show you briefly. We have another also customer success case that in Vodafone, or definitely in the popular telcos in Europe, how definitely using cloud app security and using Microsoft information protection, in this case just to make sure that remote users are productive, but at the same time also that only those individuals that should have access to those set of resources that are confidential can definitely do this in a productive way. So definitely just to mention another case where we're using all those components in real life. So as we cover those capabilities in terms of data classification, let's take a closer look to the real-time access management capabilities that we have in the Microsoft platform to follow those zero trust principles. So for the real-time access management is also when users are interacting with those applications and all that data, we definitely need to make those decisions in real time. So depending on those signals, so which kind of account I'm using and which kind of application I'm using. And also remember, if we combine those things like which kind of device and from which location or which country I'm logging in and which kind of application, I'm just using a browser or I'm using a desktop application or I'm using a mobile application. So basically all those factors can be combined, and through the combination of all those different signals, a decision can be made. So you can say, you know what, yes, actually you typically say connect from Seattle and typically connect from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Monday to Friday. So that's part of the typical usage baseline. But let's say if you have like at 2 a.m. on a Sunday, there's a connection attempt made from Paris, you know, that the user doesn't connect typically from that country. And this is not that typical device that is identity user. So that definitely can basically just alert you. Definitely this is a suspicious activity. This is not normal. So maybe it's actually an attack. So we have all those capabilities embedded out of the box. So definitely will be a combination of those components from Azure AD, like identity protection. We have also Microsoft Defender for Identity. All those different components combined can help us to basically facilitate the process to make those decisions in real time. So for that extended policy enforcement, you can definitely, what I like about conditional access in combination of cloud app security is that you can apply those policies in real time. So as users are connecting to the application, it will gather all those different signals and automatically will assess the risk. You can say, why this is the level of risk. So, okay, this is a user, okay, typically connect from this device and this typically connects at this hour. So yeah, this is a lower risk. But if users connect from an unhealthy device and a location that is typically not the one that the users connects from, then basically this is a higher risk. So depending if the risk is higher or lower, you can automate the response, what happens next. So definitely you can do that in session monitoring with cloud app security. And you can combine this, of course, with a conditional access to make a decision. In terms of threat protection, let's explore the capabilities that we have available here. So in terms of threat protection, will be all about definitely differentiate all those requests that are legit, and those requests that maybe are actually an attempt to gain control over your identities or gain control and exfiltrate the data. So With the threat capabilities that I have available in there, will be definitely in real time, assessing as a user's interacting with your applications and the services. We'll definitely gather all that telemetry and we'll apply it on the cloud, all those advanced capabilities, and we'll validate those things and do those models to validate. All right, let's see. Okay, typically those are kind of the applications. So definitely if users use those applications on a daily basis, so there's a lower risk, but it is a new application or they see any abnormal behavior on that specific session, you can just put a higher risk automatically. So that's actually what Cloud App Security does behind the scenes. One more time, just highlight that this works not just with Microsoft-based applications, so Cloud App Security works with a huge catalog of third-party applications. So therefore, you can just make sure that the data stays safe across all those different applications as part of that zero trust strategy. Next element that we have as part of that zero trust strategy is cloud security posture management. So we have some nice capabilities available as well as part of Cloud App Security. So for that security posture management, we definitely need to identify as users are interacting with all those different applications. It will definitely manipulate the data. You will definitely need to combine all those different signals. So which kind of identity, which kind of application, which kind of device. You can definitely separate, okay, those applications that are authorized. You can use those applications to interact with data that's coming from that corporate environment, and maybe you can sanction those apps and say, you know what, those applications are blocked. You can just not use those applications to interact with corporate resources. So you can definitely obtain those recommendations about the applications in real time. So already Cloud App Security will discover and will know definitely differentiate those applications that typically are safe, applications that are unsafe to work with the data. And what I like about also Cloud App Security is that can actually honor all those labels coming from Microsoft Information Protection. So all those labels on those policies can be honored directly into those definitions in Cloud App Security. Next component is about how we can apply those zero trust principles for the data aspect. So for the data aspect, it's all about how we can definitely be sure that the data stays protected over time. So we have three core elements. The first one is know your data to determine definitely what needs to be protected based on that zero trust approach. Remember, assume breach. Second, definitely need to be flexible. So definitely depending on a specific signal. So definitely this is a corporate device. Let's just as users access to that data, but this is not a device that maybe is corporate or is a device that is on a handle state. Maybe I will not let access to those resources. And something important is that in some cases we forgot about the insider risk. So definitely there's an important statistic that more than 50% of data exfiltrations and data breaches basically were originated by insider elements. So definitely maybe someone is about to leave the company, or in some cases just maybe people that intentionally or unintentionally in some cases actually just share that data that is confidential with someone outside the organization. So it's also very important to effectively manage those insider risk as well. So Microsoft 365 has actually a solution that is called insider risk management. You can definitely facilitate that process so you can stay in control. It doesn't matter if those threats are internal or external to the organization. Just make sure that definitely the data is always protected. So first step is to know your data. So once you know your data, you can classify the data and apply all those different controls to it. So in the first step to know your data, there's an interesting statistic that says that definitely data just keeps growing every day. So there's an interesting actually number that by 2025, there will be around like 125 zettabytes of information that we kind of the volume of data that we're expecting by then. So definitely just data keeps growing every day. It's important to definitely stay on track, validate what kind of data, and definitely those levels of access to the information and where the data is created and what's the typical workflow that users follow to interact with the data. So first we definitely need to discover data so we can apply all those classification levels. So what I like about the Microsoft Identity Protection solution is that you have a list of different classifiers, so definitely can just easily spot like common data types, like let's say data related to financial records. It could be things like credit cards or account numbers. It could be definitely things like healthcare or any PII. So definitely things like driver license or social security numbers. You have a bunch of 120 types of records that already come out by default in Microsoft 365. Otherwise, you can actually use a customized approach. You can create your own, either a specific pattern that matches records that you have internally. You can actually use machine learning to train and build your own model, but it's all about definitely knowing your data and appropriately classify the data and apply those labels. So later on, once you label the data, you can apply all those labels and all those policies in terms of information protection, those sensitivity labels, or could be also policies around data loss prevention. So you have definitely that flexible set of controls that can be applied. So definitely once you identify the data, then you will apply the label. So once you apply the label, you can decide what happens next. So you can encrypt the files, you can control who has access over those files, you can definitely apply visual markings like maybe a font in a different type or watermark. You can definitely also provide policy tips to users. Maybe one of the first steps typically we'll do is just proactively let users know that, you know what, this is a file that is confidential. So you're actually sending that file to someone that is external. So maybe it's not a good idea. You can just proactively alert users when this happens. You can also combine this with cloud app security. You can actually block, for example, upload of files in real time to a third-party cloud-based applications, or you can actually also block sharing. So you can say, you know what, you can only share that file, but only with people inside the company. So you can definitely do something like that with that Microsoft information protection solution. So how we can effectively manage that insider risk and policy violations? So also have all those different templates as well. You can definitely protect those files on the fly. For example, as I'm uploading a file, let's say in a specific SharePoint library, automatically that file can be labeled and protected. Or on the fly, as I'm sending an email, maybe I'm sending an email to an external recipient, and automatically I can get a policy applied to that file or that email message at that moment in transit. So you can definitely automate the response. You can definitely react in real time. You can definitely use machine learning and all those models to properly tag and label the data. Last piece around visibility and analytics, just definitely how you can combine all those different elements. So on the top, we have definitely a nice solutions. Maybe we heard about Azure Sentinel. Typically, Azure Sentinel is refers that CM, that security incident and event management solution. So what I like about Azure Sentinel is that definitely is multi-cloud, can be easily extended outside Azure. So it works with connectors. Those connectors will just ingest that data in Azure Sentinel. So once the data is inside Sentinel, we'll use advanced machine learning and artificial intelligence models. We can definitely predict and proactively find incidents on your environment. So this can be combined, of course, with Microsoft Defender. First, let's concentrate on Azure Sentinel. So definitely Azure Sentinel. Definitely just collect that data coming from all those different connectors. It could be Microsoft or third-party based solutions. It can be anything. And basically we'll just ingest, could be information around authentication, authorization, information, let's say, related to the network traffic. So all those could be multiple data sources. So we'll correlate all those events and we'll definitely proactively identify all those incidents for you. So definitely this can decrease significantly what is known as alert fatigue. You can definitely know that. So you can definitely be easily overwhelmed with millions of records related to alerts in a single day. So definitely that would definitely just need to spend a lot of time to try to create insights from this. So you can definitely let Azure Sentinel spot those incidents for you and alert you proactively if there's something likely that needs your attention. On top of that, on the other end, we have Microsoft Defenders. Microsoft 365 Defender is all about definitely making sure all those workloads related to Microsoft 365, like identities, endpoints, applications, and all those files and email messages are protected. So definitely have like phishing attacks or something like that don't affect those workloads. And we also have for Azure-based workloads, we have Azure Defenders. So definitely just make sure that those servers, databases, IaaS, PaaS-based workloads are also protected if those are hosted on Azure. So when you combine those, keep in mind that actually this can not just alert you, what I like about Azure Sentinel, Microsoft Defender, is that capability to automate the response. So it can proactively spot those incidents and even automatically respond based on certain conditions. So let's explore first the Microsoft 365 Defender capabilities. So definitely those can spot all those different attacks related to phishing, or you have maybe attacks that would like to basically compromise your identity. So Microsoft 365 Defender has all the set of measures basically to spot all those issues and block those behaviors. On the other hand, the Azure Defender is more of definitely IaaS, PaaS, basically all those workloads that are hosted on Azure. Nowadays, we also have IoT in some scenarios. Maybe you have IoT devices, you would like to make sure that those are also protected as well. So what I like about also Azure Defender, it is more than Azure. So now we have connectors, and through those connectors, you can actually expand those capabilities outside Azure. So this can be connected with AWS and GCP environments. You can assess the security state of all these environments as well. So definitely there's a combination of those. Make sure definitely all those different types of workloads are protected. You proactively identify those security threats and automate the response as well. So let's see this in action. Let me show you how we can apply that zero trust and make sure that that data is secured. So let's take a look how we can make sure that data stays protected. So let's go to Cloud App Security. Cloud App Security, you see this is the dashboard. So automatically will spot for me all these different alerts in the last 30 days. So we'll already triage those are low, medium, and high severity alerts. You can definitely have users to investigate, applications to investigate. You can definitely just keep an eye on all of those at a glance. So let's explore those discovery capabilities. So go to Cloud Discovery Dashboard. We've already identified kind of the applications, IP addresses, users, devices, and the traffic that is being generated. So for example, you see app categories. So typically see that users interact with webmail applications, collaborations, social network, content management, and news and entertainment applications. And you can also spot the traffic, and you can definitely see the amount of traffic that is related to sanctioned and unsanctioned applications. So let's take a closer look to those discovered apps. So go to the apps, you will see that it's one of those applications. By default, we have a score. The highest is the score, the safest is the application, and with a flip of a switch, you can basically block or unblock those applications that can be used on your environment. So with this, we just discover how you can apply that zero trust architecture to protect your applications and your data, and that will be the end of module number 3. So I just show you how you can use Cloud App Security to make sure that data and those applications are configured on a secure state following that zero trust architecture. So with that, we just concluded the content of that module number 3. This concludes part 1. Let's recap all the content we covered. So we start with module number 1. We talk about what is zero trust and where actually that term was originally created. Module 2, we explore all the solutions like Azure AD that can help us in this case to apply those zero trust strategies for identities and devices. Module number 3, after that, we'll explore how all those strategies can be applied for data and applications. So thank you for attendance so far, and we look forward to seeing you next time for part 2 of this Microsoft Virtual Training Day, Zero Trust.